I'm going to begin this episode with a not very philosophical question. It's this. What's the best hybrid pairing for a zombie story? Is it a zombie comedy, like in Zombieland, that film that you may well have seen? How about a zombie romance? There's a book and a film called Warm Bodies, which is a pretty good execution of that, if you didn't believe it was possible. Or how about a more sort of silly, meta zombie story, which pokes fun at the genre? I thought I might be watching one of those last night. I stuck on Army of the Dead, the new Zack Snyder film. I think it was less meta than I expected. But anyway, to get to the point, to relate this to the story we're going to cover on the episode, it's actually possible for a story to be all those three hybrid models I just listed and still be good. And that's exactly the story we're going to be doing today in this episode. It's Flower of the Other Shore by Xueting. We'll get more onto that later, as per usual. First thing we're going to do is the TrChFic news, the translated Chinese fiction news. So 3 items today, although really it's just 2. The pretty much traditional one news item which relates to Chinese sci-fi, because there is one of those today. Something about the academic world, and then a meta piece of news. Appropriately enough, we're doing meta news about this show reporting on itself. So the first news item, like I said, it's Chinese sci-fi. It's about Hao Jingfang's Vagabonds, which we've covered on this show. And the episode I did on that, I talked to its translator Ken Liu. So great news for Hao Laoshi and Ken Liu. I say their book. Yeah, I guess it is. The English translation, Vagabonds, has been nominated for the 2020 Arthur C. Clarke Award. Let's see which books it's sitting alongside, shall we? The Infinite by Patience Agbabi. I suspect I'm going to possibly be pronouncing a few of these names wrong. So, The Infinite by Patience Agbabi. The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. Could be Jimenez, but I suspect not. Maybe Jimenez. Don't know. Next one is our book, in quotes. Vagabonds by Hao Jingfang. The next one, Edge of Heaven by R.B. Kelly. And after that, The Animals in That Country, Laura Jean Mackay. And last of all, Chilling Effect, Valerie Valdez. And interestingly enough, the publishers of each of these books are listed in quotes, and we have at least 2 which are UK presses. Patience Agbabi's book The Infinite was published by Canongate. They're based in Edinburgh, in my home country, Scotland. But the thing that jumped out at me is Vagabonds, their publisher is listed as Head of Zeus. But if you're buying the book in the States, you'll be getting it, I think, from Simon & Schuster. And they were my point of contact setting up the interview, or at least the review copy that I read before interviewing Kent. So perhaps Head of Zeus were the ones who bought the translation rights and handled it at the first off. Perhaps not. Or maybe Arthur C. Clarke googled the book and they got Head of Zeus first. I don't know. Just thought that was interesting. Anyway, we should crack on and get to the next piece of news. So this is about the new journal which the Leeds Centre for Chinese Writing has launched. So they've solicited a call for papers. I guess I should read that after I read the info about the journal itself. So they're called the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writing. Their journal is it's just called Writing Chinese Journal. No, it's not. It's called Writing Chinese, a Journal of Contemporary Sinophone Literature. That's what it is. So I'll just read you the text that they've got to sort of introduce it. Here it is. Our journal showcases the latest peer-reviewed academic research on contemporary Chinese language literature and its translation and global reception, alongside features on practitioners. The combination of academic articles and practice-based notes provides a platform for and facilitates dialogue between both primary and secondary actors in the field. A key objective of our journal is to engage directly with scholarship in East Asia, and to this end, one section in each issue features newly commissioned English translations of the latest Chinese language research. This journal is proud to be entirely open access. And their call for papers has like a short summary of it here, so I'll just read that. Call for papers July 2021. We are delighted to share the first call for papers from Writing Chinese Journal. I've shortened that. Alongside submissions received in response to this call for papers, the inaugural issue will also include keynotes from Professor Bonnie S. McDougall and renowned poet, academic and translator Xi Chuan. Very nice. I did shorten that slightly, and there is a fuller version on the site you can read as well. And yeah, you should just check that out. It looks pretty cool. Right, so onto the meta news now. The news about this show. Just two small, dumb things. One is sad, one is happy. So I'll start with the sad news. So if you've been listening for a while, you'll know that I have a feed on the Chinese podcast site Ximalaya for a way for people to access the show if they don't have a VPN, basically. And that was working fine. I had been clever about which episodes to sort of disguise slightly in their description. But now the censors have properly spotted the show because lots of the episodes have been taken down. It seems like any episodes which do not offend the censor, which is maybe like 2/3 of them, are still up. And it may still be possible to get them up. I'm not going to give up just yet. I think my rule will be I'll keep uploading them, let the censors do what they will, whatever. If the whole feed is taken down, that's a shame, but I'm not going to change my behavior to accommodate the censor, which is why I'm talking about this. Even if this creates a chance this episode might get taken down, if I police myself according to the oppressive laws of a country that I don't even live in anymore, then really that's a sad state of affairs, isn't it? What I am going to try and do is find another sort of channel that will get the episodes behind the firewall. Don't know what that would be though, because I'm looking for something where it can't be struck down. But I don't know what that would be. It would ideally be something which has its servers and company well outside of the PRC, but which is not blocked in the PRC. But that really, that slims the options down a lot, doesn't it? I'll have to see if that's even possible. But yeah, that's the sad news. On to the happy piece of meta news. So I made 3 stupid little attempts at memes, little funny, don't know what you call them, like parody book covers, or I don't know if parody is the right word. There's probably a better word, but like jokey covers for 3 translated Chinese books. One was the 3 body problem, but I changed it into the 3 birdie problem and put the 3 legendary birds from Pokemon Red and Blue and Yellow on it. And then there was another one, which was Legend of the Condor Heroes, but I swapped out the C for a G, so it became Gondor Heroes. One of them, the 3 body one, that found a bit of success on Twitter. But there was one other meme I made that it just blew up. I did put a bit more effort into it, to be fair, but it was like I won't quite explain how it works, because then why would you go and look for it yourself? But it's a mashup of Harry Potter and Lu Xun, and that did way better than I expected. So there's a link if you want to see that image if you've not seen it already in the show notes. It's also on the show's Instagram page, which is it's just at TrChFic, TrChFic on Twitter. If you scroll down through my tweets, you'll find it pretty quickly. I'm at Angus Likes Words. Okay, that will be all for the news. So enough of my talking about very stupid matters. Let's get on to very literary matters and begin the interview with Xueting Christine Ni about Flower of the Other Shore by Ashwe. So on the show we have Xueting Ni. Xueting, how's it going and what have you been up to?
Hello Angus, I'm very well, thank you. It's going well. So the lockdown restrictions have lifted now, but we haven't really been going out much yet. So apart from the day job and putting the finishing touches on Synopticon, I've been catching up on some Chinese TV series and on some reading for pleasure. And I know people say that lockdown, you're supposed to have plenty of free time, more free time than usual during lockdown, but that's not what I found. I think I've been, really quite busy over the last year and a half.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I suppose when everyone has the option to be online all the time, other people might assume that you're always available. I've not been hit too bad by that, but yeah, I resonate with that. I felt very free in the strange, restricted way that lockdown felt, sort of liberating, not being obliged to go outside, but that feeling faded pretty quickly. Here we are, a year plus later, doesn't feel, there's no tingle of something different and exciting anymore. It's just sort of, it's reality. It's normality now.
Yeah, I think when it happened, it was, the epidemic has become a pandemic and we might have to go into lockdown. And then it was March 2020, wasn't it, that it happened, and you kind of thought, oh, can't believe this is really happening. It's like being a movie. And then, oh, it will only be a few months, maybe 6 months. And I think it was kind of new, very an incredible experience to begin with. But then it just, yes, I think it's becoming a little bit normalized, working from home and staying indoors.
And for any listeners wondering which particular iteration of lockdown we're talking about, it's lockdown in the UK. We're both in England right now. I think I'm in Cheshire these days. Should warn listeners and yourself, Xueting, the house I've moved to is both next to a railway and under the flight path of Manchester Airport. So if you hear any rumbling or whooshing, that's what that is. I've gone from being next to an airbase in Fife, Scotland, to two transit. Oh, there's a plane now. 2 transit routes in England. And you're down in London, if I've understood that right.
That's right. Yes, I'm in Hertfordshire. Yes, right. I'm very glad to. I moved out. I pretty much, after coming to the UK, I've been living in London, sort of in the city or in the suburbs. And I moved out into Hertfordshire recently. I'm very glad to have done that, I think, because it made lockdown a lot more bearable. There's lots of green space around me. There's lots of open space, lots of parks and woods. It's nice to go for a walk in and nice to get out in the open for exercise when one can. So I'm surprised to hear that you're under a railway bridge and near the airport, because your equipment must be really, really good, because I'm not hearing anything.
That's
any
good.
Noise.
I'm sort of shielded from the window, and I'm in a corner, and it is just a railway, not a railway bridge, and I am shielded by a house. You might hear if a freight train comes through, then you might really hear it. But my moaning and whining aside, funnily enough, we did mention a couple of things there somewhat related to our story for this episode. We mentioned, apocalyptic situations. We mentioned feeling like you're living in a movie, which is strangely relevant to the story more than listeners might expect, although we're not going to reveal entirely why. And an escape from the city to leafier pastures. That's sort of in the story too, in many ways, actually. The story's Flower of the Other Shore by Atra, and it's in that book you mentioned, Synopticon. But before we start talking about Synopticon, can you tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself?
So I write about Chinese culture from all kinds of angles, with a focus on contemporary and pop culture, although I also write a lot about how tradition feeds into this, traditional culture and classical culture. I also translate literature, which is why I'm on this podcast, my new book, Synopticon. So yes, that is, so I've been writing about Chinese culture since about 2010. And my last book was published in 2018, called From Guanyin to Chairman Mao, an essential guide to Chinese deities.
I see what you did there in the title.
Right. Yes. It was. It's actually a title that was suggested by the publishers.
Right. Okay.
And it's a cool title, bit of a mouthful, but in a way it reflects the approach that the book takes, giving a brief history of each deity in the socio-cultural context, and then bringing it into the contemporary observations and influences and impact of the deity.
Sounds really cool. What you're saying about the title being a mouthful, my sort of brief stint in book publishing, I learned just why, or one reason just why non-fiction books often have those great big long titles. It's because you can get the subtitle as well as your main title, and that's really good for hitting keywords, or keywords, I should say, not keywords, which if you're selling books on Amazon, you really want those because you want to show up in the search results. Not saying that's an editor's only priority there, but when I was in the shoes of trying to make the books beat the other books in the search results, the long title becomes strangely tempting.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, that's a good neat trick.
Yeah, you can kind of see it in some Amazon products, not maybe more so in other things like physical. What am I trying to say? Non-bookish products, where they'll put an absolute mash of words into the item's name, and it's just to game the system. But we should probably not talk too much about Amazon. I think they get enough thought devoted to them. I think what we should devote our thoughts to is Synopticon first, as sort of laying the groundwork to talk about Achue's short story, Flower of the Other Shore. So it is an anthology of translated Chinese science fiction, and you're the translator and you're the editor. So there's some other books out there which are sort of similar. The two that listeners, or the one maybe that listeners might be thinking of, is Ken Liu's Invisible Planets, and his I don't know if you call it a follow-up, but his other book he put together like that, Broken Stars. And my hipster one that I'm always trying to big up on the show is the Columbia University Press and Chinese University of Hong Kong's slightly more academic, or slightly more, well, it's more collaborative, isn't it? Because it's not one translator. They've got one called The Reincarnated
Giant.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of patchwork approach that sets it apart from your book and Kent's, because there's lots of translators, lots of styles.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you after that long waffle is, where does your book, or I'll say your book, where does it sit in relation to them in your own from your own point of view?
First of all, I've read a lot of the stories from those anthologies. I got a chance to read most of them, the later ones, after I'd handed in my first draft last year. So, and I really enjoy them. They're great stories and great collections. This anthology, however, was it's very much its own thing and hasn't really been conceived in comparison to any of the other books or as a reaction to the other anthologies. I've always been interested in China's genre fiction, not just sci-fi, but other types of genre fiction. And I saw the beginnings of the industries of these genre fiction in the 2000s, and I saw it maturing later in the decade, but it really took about 10 years before I could get anybody to listen to me.
Right.
Yes, so it's not just science fiction, but things like animation, there's comics, there's suspense thrillers and horror and wuxia, other types of fantasy, historical epics, 玄幻, 奇幻, and all of these cool things out there. So in terms of translation, I mean, if you talk to some, say, American male translators, they might tell you that when the reason they started translating is because they saw a professional piece of translation done quite badly. But for me, going from Chinese to English has always been a bit like second nature, really. As someone who was born in China, in Guangzhou, and was then transplanted in the UK at a young age, it's sort of like everything in my life was part of that process of translation of culture, not just language. And I suppose the other thing is, back in the 80s, my mother was an interpreter.
All right, cool.
And it was a huge thing back then. And when I was little, I thought it was the height of Sino-English interaction. I thought, it was so cool. She met all these interesting people from, the outside and brought back all these interesting things, interesting objects. And as I grew up, I wanted to take this further into literary translation. But now I actually find that my cultural insights have become far more important, especially now and in the last decade, when China is becoming more economically more powerful, but culturally people still don't really understand it. There are some who try to present a simplistic view, but it's actually a very complex place with a complex history and development, especially in the modern times. And understanding China requires a lot of contextualizing. So for me, it's never been about just about sci-fi, but all that's contemporary and amazing that's coming out of China.
I share your interest in genre fiction and the sort of desire to push it a little bit more front and center in the people's minds, not just in relation to China, just in general. I think I'm on team genre fiction for sure.
Great to have you on the team.
For sure, yeah. I mean, maybe not dogmatically so, but if I had to pick, team genre fiction all the way.
I mean, I think that genres really blend into each other a lot more, blur into each other a lot more than the boundaries between literary and genre fiction is not that clear cut to me anyway.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And as well as blending the boundary between what's in quote marks literary and what's genre-y, as well as that being a blurred boundary, I think there is as we're going to see in this story, a blurred or hard to demarcate boundary between the different genres. And also, I think what form those genres take, whether they are really pulpy, whether they are the silly thing that the literary fiction academic in their tower, if they might have an idea of genre fiction that it's pulp, it's silly, it's lowbrow, and us on team genre fiction might say actually it can be just as deep and subversive and clever and worthy of attention as literary fiction. And I think the reality is genre fiction does all those things often all at once in one story. And I think there's an argument to be made that's kind of a description of Flower of the Shore. It's got some quite insightful moments and lots of other more playful, dare I say it, pulpy moments, as we're going to see as we get into it. And I was going to say we might end up
absolutely
scratching our heads about what genre it even is, because this is a kehuan, a Chinese sci-fi collection. But if I was handed this story out of this context, I wouldn't have called it sci-fi. I probably would have called it horror or even action. Not that I read much action fiction, if that's even a genre, but that's there. Or you could call it a love story as well. All these things work.
Oh yeah, it's definitely crosses genres. It's interesting you say you wouldn't consider it sci-fi.
Not if I had to pick one genre, I would probably pick horror, because I'll say it now. It might be getting ahead of ourselves. It's kind of a zombie story.
It is a zombie story. That's right.
So last question about Synopticon. It's got a fuller title as well. We're talking about titles and subtitles. So the title that's on the cover is Synopticon, and then the colon that introduces the subtitle, A Celebration of Chinese Science Fiction. So I wanted to ask you, if we just, what can I say? If we break it down possibly past the point of common sense, do A Celebration of Chinese Fiction tell us anything about sort of your vision for what you were trying to do with this anthology? Or is it just something the editors wanted in there to help keyword the book?
Name with Synopticon is definitely an intentional name titling. Essentially, it's a cool word and it means a viewpoint from China. And with this anthology, I really aim to present as a range of subject matter and styles as possible of science fiction within the last Renaissance, i.e. the last 30 years, showing the history of it, kinds of stories that maybe authors were writing 30 years ago and the kind that they're writing now.
Right.
And I also aim to feature some authors that haven't broken the popularity popularity barrier, maybe you could say, in English translation. So I'd say Synopticon isn't just sci-fi, it's China, it's viewpoints from China really.
Right.
Then the celebration, I suppose that's a demonstration that it's not a collection aimed to, with a narrative to show a particular literary movement, and it's not a best of anthology. It is really a medley to show the great stories, the great contemporary stories that are coming out of this genre, out of Ke.
Yeah, that's great. It's not a million miles away from one thing I try to do on this podcast, which is just say, look, these are fun. You don't have to. It's great to view them through particular lenses, but first take a look at the story itself and just enjoy it, and then you can overthink it later. I think Ken Leo says a somewhat similar thing in his intro to Invisible Planets. Just take it on its own terms, at least first. I would tend to agree.
That's right. So that's why I've provided some short guides to each story. This was something that I discussed with the editors and my publishers, but I wanted to have those guides at the back of each story instead of in front as an introduction, so that in that way they still provide some context, to some background to the authors and context of the place and environment, cultural environment the story is coming out of. But after the story is read, and so the readers can just read the story as it is, without any influence from me or from the publishers first. And then if they want to find out more about it, then they can read the story guide afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to do it on your part and the editors for listening to you. And I should also say I thought they were particularly good in another way, in that they're not too long either, so you're not leaving too much of a sort of the translators or editors footprint. They're just right. They're not too short either, and they don't they explain helpfully, and they never really sort of over explain or feel didactic. So as a reader, I thought they were really good. I know I've heard other translators say, I don't want to over explain, leave a million footnotes, add my own words to the text, but that sort of, to my mind, that's a sort of all or nothing framing, where it's either leave no mark and that's ideal, or leave a heavy mark and explain. Whereas actually, if you're clever, if you find a way to get a little bit of both, or navigate the translator's dilemma in the clever way that you did in this book, it doesn't have to be a dilemma. You can both serve the reader in a nice, minimal, helpful way. It's a question of, like, what's the word? No, the word's not coming. But yeah, I appreciated them. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I absolutely, I agree with that. There's a place for there's a time for footnotes, and a little bit of explanation helps. But maybe not a massive amount.
For sure.
That's bogged down the reader. But
I thought of the word I was going to say. It was dexterity. Dexterity or that sort of ability is a way to break through those dilemmas. So,
yeah, I like that word.
Yeah, it's a good word. Good word for writers and editors and wordsmiths, I think. Right, next question before I start talking about writing for an hour. It's about the stories in Synopticon. So I asked the last question about the book. Totally not true. There's two more. The first one's about internationalism, something, one of my favorite isms, specifically about the names in the book, or at least that's the jump off point. So again, thinking back to the three other books I read, and a lot of translated Chinese fiction I've read, I don't recall running into a lot of both foreign characters, or I should say foreign is a loaded word, non-Chinese characters, or characters who have a non-Chinese name. There's not so many. There are some, but like I can't think of so many. And in Synopticon, there's quite a diversity of names. There's quite a lot of characters who maybe their nationality or their ethnicity isn't specified, or maybe it is, but there's plenty of non-Han Chinese names in there. And maybe I look too hard for these things, but I wanted to ask you, is that a product of your intention to seek out sort of diverse stories and get a very broad perspective? or is it just something? Or sorry, I should say, is it an intentional result of that, or is it a natural result of that, or something else?
I think it's a natural result, really. I did have the intention of seeking out diverse stories in terms of style and tone and content, but the names, they're just part and parcel of Chinese writing, really. My criteria for selection for the collection was, is the story good? Is it enjoyable? Is it well written? And probably contrary to a lot of perceptions of China, Chinese isn't the only everyday language in China. There's lots of English in all sorts of things, shop names, products, English romanizations of Chinese terms. It's this idea that what is foreign is cool. It's like Europeans and Westerners, many like to wear T-shirts with Japanese characters or Chinese characters in them. You don't even have to make sense. It just looks cool. And for the Chinese, it's something similar but reverse. So it is part of, the English language is part of their everyday too, as well as Chinese.
Two very silly thoughts popped into my mind as you were answering that question. One is my favorite phoneticized foreign name in Chinese is Harry Styles. And rather than saying it, I'll just say to the listeners, if this stuff isn't obvious to you, maybe if you're sort of new to the world of Chinese and English and how they interact, pop onto Harry Styles' Wikipedia page, switch to the Chinese language version and teach yourself his name in Mandarin. Maybe this is silly, but I like that one a lot. The other one was what you said about sort of how these languages coexist, even if it's not correctly, even if it's gibberish, just spelled using the characters.
Yeah,
I have a nice example of that. Because you're right. If you live in a country where people wear super dry clothes, you'll see Japanese walking through any town centre on some man's chest. But it's not, as I learned, you really can't trust that to mean anything. I suppose you'd always expect that, but I had it confirmed when we had at my school, we had, long story short, I was in a UN, my school entered in a UN competition. I was in the team, and what that cashed out to was we had exchange visitors from Japan who then we visited.
Oh, how nice.
It was great. I think we visited them first, then they came over. So we were taking our new pals through Dundee city centre, and we walked by, I think it was H&M, and H&M had this t-shirt in the window, which I thought looked kind of retro and cool at the time. It was white, and it had the Rolling Stones 40 Licks lips and tongue in sort of rainbow pattern. I suppose that doesn't have the meaning it would have now, different times. But alongside that kind of funky rainbow lips. It had, I wouldn't have known the difference between Japanese and Chinese at the time, but it was Japanese. And our exchange student friends sort of stopped, did a double take and started to laugh. And we asked them, does it say something awful? Is it a practical joke? And they said, no, it's gibberish. It literally doesn't mean anything. We can't even tell you what it means because it's just a mashed together of God knows what characters. And it wasn't a shock, to be honest, because it's just confirming a suspicion that it's the equivalent of someone getting like Neo Romean tattooed on his arm. It's just there for the aesthetic.
The famous bad tattoos. Yes, always get its sense checked before you have it permanently tattooed on your arm or leg. Yeah. I mean, they look cool. I mean, that's the thing. They probably don't mean anything, but they look cool. And actually, the main point I wanted to make was actually science fiction is about exploring things that are beyond the boundaries of time, space, reality, or certainly national borders. So for the Chinese writers to limit themselves to a setting of China, it would kind of defeat the purpose of a speculative type of writing.
For sure. And I think in plenty of stories in your book and elsewhere I've read translated Chinese sci-fi stories, there'll be some characters where you feel like some authors who have sort of assumed that the status quo of a world made of nation states built around basically ethnic categories is going to continue. Like, that's one criticism someone could level at a lot of the three body problem. But there's plenty other stories, probably a majority actually, where it's sort of left ambiguous, or we're not so far in the future where it's a question. But in the far future, yeah, there is a sort of a cultural or just linguistic ambiguity that the author doesn't over explain, which to me seems to be sort of the right way to do it, because how would you know what mankind's going to look like X number of 100 or 1,000 years? What things will survive? What things will become irrelevant? What things will blur or reconfigure themselves? And yeah, it's nice that some of the authors don't try and lecture to us or over explain their own creative vision.
Yes, we don't know. Nobody knows. That's why this science fiction genre is so exciting, in that it, we try to imagine what it might be like.
Yeah, I'm going to keep us moving. Last question. This is actually the last question about the book as a whole. It's about the question of taste, which I think we've already definitely talked about tastes and preferences. So another question on that theme. Now, I'm not actually going to ask you to name a favorite or rank the stories, because that's not fair at all. But I think I can safely ask you, are there any stories or authors from the collection who aren't Ashwe and aren't Flower of the Other Shore that you'd like to just sort of fly the flag for our listeners, that, I don't know, you could enthuse about?
I think it wouldn't be fair for me to talk about any authors as a favorite. It would be like asking me who's your favorite child,
For sure.
They're all so different, so can't really compare like for like. I really enjoyed translating them all. Some stories are not such an easy read, but I thought it was important to have them there for all sorts of reasons. I mean, for example, I really enjoyed working on The Last Safe. It's a work where storytelling and science are blended in very well, and it features just one type of technology, and the impact of that technology is omniscient, and yet the story is very much focused on the everyday life, on the individual that this technology has impacted on. So that's really interesting. That's exploration, a demonstration that science fiction doesn't have to be always about, interplanetary explorations, interplanetary journeys, or kind of galactic wars or whatever, survival epics or disaster tales. But then there are stories in the collection that are at the other end of the scale, like Starship Library, which has a ginormous span in terms of time and distance, in that it crosses planets and millions of years.
And perhaps appropriately, one's the first story in the collection, one's the last.
That's right. And it's about so many things on a grand scale, but also about the process of learning, something that transcends different planets and civilizations. And there's so much quirky humor in it that reminds me a lot of British sci-fi that I really love. So I really liked working on that one. I really liked working on Meisje met der Peril. Please excuse me, any Dutch speakers.
Yeah, all 5 of them are fuming right now.
I really enjoyed that story because I'm a big fan of classical music and European traditional classical painting. And it was really nice to be able to translate a story with with a sci-fi principle in it that has time travel, but also I get to translate a story. It also features Bach's music and Dutch paintings, and also the descriptions of Chinese cooking were just a delight to work on. So they're all very different, and I think for readers, I think they should just look at the table of contents and pick whatever they fancy and go with it, really.
I had thoughts about, especially those first two you mentioned. They both reminded me of some other Chinese sci-fi I've read out there. The Last Save reminded me of quite a lot of the stories that the London Chinese science fiction group have covered, a little reading group that
Oh,
runs,
interesting.
I think, monthly. I think I might have missed a meeting or two while I've been moving house, but a lot of the short stories they cover have a sort of a similar vibe. You could, if you were looking for a comparison, an easy comparison to file them under,
Yeah.
like sort of Black Mirror-esque. You can see this in some of Shadja's stories as well, where you have sort of a piece of technology which is kind of innocuous, maybe a little bit smartphone-esque, that completely transforms the ways people live. In Black Mirror, it's usually for the worst, but in a lot of these short Chinese sci-fi
Yes.
stories I've read, it's a bit more ambiguous. It could be on balance better or worse depending on one's preferences as a person. So that's what that one sort of reminded me of in a good way, for sure. And then what you were saying about Starship Library, how it transcends, how it covers such a crazy scale of time and space, and how there's a sort of a theme of keeping a torch going for humanity. That reminded me of some of the stuff I liked most about the three body problem, the stuff that really moved me. For all the kind of grim stuff that's in those books and maybe cynical calculations about what humans are like, there's a real sincerity there as well, I felt. And I felt it without all the grimness, with a bit of humor in Starship Library. So that one was one of my faves in the book, because as well as being a very gentle story, it stirred something in me. And I'm sure your translation helped that. So I would enthuse about those two, but especially Starship Library as well. A really great one.
It's a really interesting point that pertains to Chinese storytelling in general, because Chinese stories don't tend to have happy endings. They just don't. Whether it's whatever the genre, whatever the medium, from historical times to contemporary times, they just don't have happy endings. But I am finding that in contemporary Chinese science fiction, which I guess is reflected in my book, that there is a sense of transcendence very often at the end of a story. And I find this very interesting because in a way it shows Chinese writers reclaiming the Sino-futurist viewpoint, which was by and large created by those who were outside of the Sinophone sphere. The idea of this tech-fueled nightmarish dystopia. So it's interesting that Chinese writers are reclaiming this term and creating different strands of Sino-futurism for themselves. So in a lot of the stories in my collection address issues that are perhaps not the most easy to address. And certainly bad things happen in the story. But in the end, there is a sense of hope that, after humanity has gone in quite destructive and entropic sort of directions, after all that, perhaps we can rethink and perhaps there can be a brighter future. There's a sense of hope and a sense that we can move beyond the nightmares. And even sometimes when we're in the middle of those nightmares, there are some people with clearer minds who are more self-aware, who can see that things need to change. And so this is why when I was discussing the concept of the cover design and then later refining it with my publishers and the illustrator, I emphasized I wanted an uplifting feel to the art.
I realize we could probably stay on this topic for a long time as well, but shall we venture over to the other shore and leave the other stories behind now?
Nice one. Yeah.
Thank you. I definitely had not got that written in advance. It definitely wasn't on a piece of paper in front of me. So yeah, Flower of the Other Shore by Atrueb, who is our author for this episode. I thought it's something I've been doing in recent episodes where me, the host who read this story weeks ago, is going to try and summarize, maybe not the plot, because we don't want to spoil stuff for this one, the plot's important, but I'll try and summarize like the premise and maybe like the first act, where things are going. And if you feel I've missed anything really key, then you can jump in afterwards. So the setting is somewhat ambiguous, but we're in the near future. Seems like we might be in the USA somewhere, but we can't say that for certain. Our main character feels like we have a Chinese main character who was once alive and is now a zombie, and he's seems to be in the majority, at least in the city he's in, a city populated by the undead. And we start out, he's got a bit of an itch on the back of his shoulder, and he's hanging out on a sort of a bay. It's a very interesting, powerful, I don't know, eerie place to put zombies, on a bay. The only other time I can think I've seen that was in Game of Thrones, and there's just something I love about zombies on a bay. Maybe because that's the edge of the world for them, because they can't swim. Maybe that's it. But he's there with old Jim, talking vaguely about what they've been up to, how they have a hunger they can't get rid of, and how this virus, called in English translation the necronavirus, has swept across the world. And as the plot develops, that itch in our main character's shoulder, whose name I really need. Do we? No, we don't. Yeah, we don't get a name, do we? Or he thinks he thinks he remembers a name later. I think we can say that, can't we?
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's very much a zombie for the half of the story, and then he remembers, or he thinks he remembers without spoiling anything, but his name is Hui.
Yeah,
in the middle of the story.
A glimmer of a past life, I think we can safely say, with Hui, a Chinese name. And as these memories are sort of dancing just outside of the range of his mind's eye, he's the itch in his back is turning into a flower, and we realize there's something very important about this flower that could change a lot of things. And I suppose around the same time he meets a girl. I won't say more than that, other than like he meets a girl, zombie meets living girl. An interesting story ensues. At the same time, another important thread of the plot is that the humans aren't all dead. There's a sort of a turf war going on between these undead in the city, and I think we can safely say, a very American style gung-ho meathead infantry. And I guess they have some vehicles as well, but it's if you can picture just a load of sort of video game type machine gun wielding guys lining up and blasting at these zombies who are trying to eat them. There's that. So there's all sorts of different tones in the story. And my feeling is, in a bad writer's hands, they would jar and it would feel dumb, but they're weaved together in a really smart, you could maybe sometimes call it postmodern, but not always way. There's a lot of riffing on Hollywood traditions and maybe just cinematic traditions, but for reasons I can't fully disclose, Hollywood is a presence in the story. And if readers want to know why I'm amused by that, they should read this story. Do you think that's a decent summary, or should we fill in any other gaps?
I think that's wonderful. That's great.
Thank you.
It really, I think it's really piquing the reader's interest.
Yeah, not intentional, but it's just a sign of a good story. It's so easy to do that. So
it shows you like the story.
Mm-hmm. So rather than trying to tease things on and on and on, I think we'll be able to talk about the story through some deeper questions, and that will continuously tease the readers on other levels. So first question, it's about intertextuality. Now, if any listeners did not go and do undergraduate literature at uni, that's a big word for a simple thing when a story or a piece of media references other pieces of stories. A really good way to think about it, perhaps a sort of millennium surfing the web way to think of it, is hyperlinks between the stories. If there's a moment when the main character thinks, oh, this is just like 28 Days Later, think of that as a link on a web page that connects this story with the film 28 Days Later. So, or if you want another easier way, just referencing to other texts, which can create a sort of a meta feel that it's a story not just about events, but a story about stories. And I just
like the hyperlinks version.
I love that. Yeah, it's got that sort of retro, hackers kind of feel to it. which I think should come back since we've all been living online. So I wanted
Yeah,
to
why
ask
not?
you, as the translator, in what interesting ways for you does the story plug into other genre, other media? Because you mentioned as well as genres, you're interested in media coming from China and other just styles. Like I said, like there's a lot of sincerity, there's a lot of absurdity. And the last question was what we mentioned before: is this even sci-fi? People with too much time on their hands could, I think, get into a really big argument about that.
Yeah, great. I hope they read the story and argue away. I think we talked about a bit about this before. Is it sci-fi, first of all? I would say that it is sci-fi. Perhaps there are definitely MacGuffins that Archie uses. There is science that he's made up. Sorry, my cats are trying to get in.
Zombie cats.
So definitely MacGuffins that he uses in different points of the story, although they're not like the main focus. So I would call it science fiction, maybe soft science fiction. But is it just sci-fi? No, it can be so many other things. It can be seen as so many other things. It's a horror story, although there's a lot of black comedy, humor. It is a romance and a love story. It is a point of view kind of narrative because we're getting a very unusual narrator who is dead. So then, yeah, it's horror, it's a romance. And there are certain parts of it that's like a diary, or maybe like certain thriller elements to it at certain points when there are big plot changes and fight scenes. So it is so many things, and it is a testament of Archer's skills as a writer that he's woven all these disparate elements together into one story. I really wanted to work with Archer, and I was going to translate one of his other stories about a robot originally, but he sent me this one as well, saying that it's one of his new ones. Do I want to have a read? I started reading it and finished it really quickly, even though it was 40 to 50,000 words in Chinese. And once I finished it, I wanted to translate it straight away. I knew that's the one I wanted to translate. Oh yeah, and the other genre the very obvious one, it's a zombie story, of course. Zombie story as well. And I would give it a different name, a sàngshī story. Sàngshī is the Chinese term for zombie. Sàng meaning dead, to mourning or dead, and shi is corpse. And this is not to be confused, and it's distinct from jiangshi, which means stiff corpse, which the Chinese use to refer to their own tradition of the undead. And the jiangshi are very different creatures from the sàngshī. And the sàngshī stories are very much a recent development and very much came out of Western influences, Western narratives like zombie films, comics, TV series. And I think Archer's story really shows this in that he engages in dialogue with a lot of Hollywood cinematic traditions, in particular zombie films. And it's a bit of a fanfic to Max Brooks' World War Z, this story, as we can see that with the continual reference to Brad Pitt. So it's so many things.
For sure. I was thinking as you mentioned the influence of what the Western genre on this story. We've effectively said this already, but I think it's worth teasing a bit more, that the Western genre that is the influence here, the zombie genre, and that's basically a film genre. If you could probably do a whole podcast series looking at all these different monsters who all have their own little corner of one part of the horror genre. And it's pretty true to say some of these monsters have conquered or invaded or occupied, or they're lurking in only movies or only written literature, or they're heavily on one or the other, or they're in both. So like, if you're thinking of vampires, they're in both. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of the input into that little category on the page and on the film strip. Zombies, there definitely are zombie books. Like you named World War Z, but it's probably telling if you ask people what's World War Z, the man on the street or the zombie on the street is going to say it's a film, which is fair enough because zombies, I think, are mostly they're in that corner, the film corner.
Yes, that's by far the more influential medium of the two. They do appear in comics and in books, but the zombie genre, in terms of Western tradition, definitely film is most influential.
I don't know if we can pick that apart, but I think it's an interesting thing to, and I know we said we shouldn't color readers' views of the stories before reading them, but if a reader wants to pick it apart on a second reading, it could be fun to look for how much is this a riff on cinema, not just a particular kind of story that exists in cinema, but how's the written word doing some things? How's it putting into words things we're used to processing visually and things? I mean, I'm getting far too obscure here, but a film moves at its own speed. You don't control the speed you consume it. Well, you could play at half speed or 1.5 speed, but basically films move at their own pace. You can't pause and reread a line over and over again, but think about it. On the page, you're free to do that, and that changes the game totally. So if readers want to overthink things, that's one way I'd suggest doing it. I don't have a question there for you. Do you want to say anything else about the intertextuality, or shall we go on to the next question?
That's a really interesting point you made there. Of course, stories are meant to be, fiction is meant to be read from beginning to end without stop, but as a book, the reader can read it however they like. And I suppose if a story is really good, then it does make you want to read it from beginning to end without stopping. But yes, he really does riff on a lot of zombie, not just zombie film traditions, zombie film tropes, but a Hollywood cinema. I mean, the story does parody a lot of the heroic Hollywood film tradition, for example, in the dialogue between the two characters in the middle of a fight. It breaks a lot of the fourth wall as well. So I think I might be going off the point. Yeah, so I think it's fine to move on. Let's move on to the next.
Yeah, it's okay to go a little off point. You raised a good point there. The action scenes, we can buy a guy being cool, firing his machine gun on a screen. It just doesn't look really cool on the page, so it's very ripe for parody. You're totally right there. On the topic of rereading things, I do that quite a lot, reading translated Chinese stuff for the podcast and for fun.
Do you?
Both at the same time.
Wow.
For sure,
How'd you get the time?
Indeed.
How'd you get the time to?
I suppose when I mean rereading, I mean if I see a sentence, I'll reread the sentence. I don't read many of the stories twice. But I'm just looking at one right now. It's this. It's already dusk, but the day is long in the summer of this seaside town, and the sky still shows a serene indigo. On the clear and crystalline sea, a moored rowing boat is bobbing, now sinking, now afloat. A lot of stiffs hover aimlessly around the shore. As much as I've talked up the story as being silly and fun and fourth wall breaking, it's got some really great pieces of prose, and this is where I'm going with my next question, because I find this a really pleasant read, and you know, obviously praise for that goes to two people, Ashwaya for putting together the text, and the translator yourself for creating the sentence. Well, not creating, but translating and formulating the sentence I just read into English. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think, as someone who had to not pick apart, but someone who had to get very familiar with Achwa's prose, at least in this story, what do you think about him as a writer?
I really like those parts too. And there's this Chinese literary convention called 借景写意, expressing inner feelings through descriptions of the landscape, which I guess is kind of universal, but particularly prominent in Chinese literature. And it really stems all the way from classical Chinese poetry and prose, and is still a very popular literary device, literary convention in Chinese fiction today. So you'll find in the collection, whether it is a YA story or the grittiest of thrillers, or a zombie story with black humor like this one, there are these really lovely descriptions of the natural environment, which have been really nice to translate. And it's really a demonstration of his dynamism that Xue can do parody, the sort of breaking the fourth wall humor that comically undermines some of the battles, and he can do tension and, of course, also lyrical parts like this one. I think he's a really interesting writer. So part of what I wanted to do with this book is to highlight, to redress the gender imbalance in Kehuan in particular. It is notorious for being male-dominated as a genre, although things are improving slightly now, and we're getting more female voices coming through, both in terms of female voices in the community as well as female writers. But also, what I'm also interested in is gender non-conformance. So what first appealed to me about Xue's work is that there's a softness to the male voices in his stories, which I really like. And I think that's present in our protagonist in Hui, who is a very brave and courageous character, but also very romantic and very open with his expressing his love and affection. Yeah. So there's a softness to his male characters, which I like, which isn't found in a lot of the works of other male writers. And I think this is what makes him unique in a genre where, up till very recently, hard sci-fi is just the kind of, there's a predominance towards hard sci-fi, not only featuring it in stories, but focusing on it. And to some extent in some works, there's a sort of lack of, there's a story, in some stories, you find that the science and the storytelling don't blend together very well. You can get that sometimes, and I think Xue is a male writer who can do this very well. And it's unusual to find a male writer who openly says, I write soft sci-fi. So I think he's a very interesting contemporary voice in the genre. He is quite a young writer, and what I wanted to do, apart from featuring the history of the last, some featuring stories that reflect the history of the last 30 years of development, also to feature some new voices like Xue, so post-90s writers. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what he does
for sure
as a writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a thing I liked about the story too, that we have a male character who's is not a cartoon at all, but has real feelings, is open about them, does his best to pursue them. And the idea of not being gender non-conforming, perhaps listeners who hear that phrase might think of people who are non-binary or are some not strictly on the gender binary, and that's certainly a really important meaning of that word. But I think there's a more mundane way that applies to the lives of maybe almost everyone, is how much do you either follow the line of or try and swerve from what's expected of you, or even just a tendency in yourself. Speaking from my own experience, through a lot of my life, I thought the more kind and gentle I am, the better. It doesn't matter if there's some stereotypical ideal of male. That's a bad stereotype. I shouldn't be like it. And there's other times, maybe more as an adult facing tricky situations, where I thought, well, the best way to get through this is by, in quotes, being a man. So being little bit more stoic and risking being an asshole. And then other times I think, no, I was right first time. It's better to risk being gentle and being a pushover. But to bring back a word I used earlier, dexterity is a great way through that. You can, if you're smart about how you navigate these gendered things, as a man,
that's right.
You can be both. And I think the character and the writing display that really well. And if he wasn't such a dexterous writer, maybe he couldn't pull it off.
Exactly. I mean, you can be gentle without being weak, and you can be tough without being,
Horrid.
an asshole.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, I don't think any gender, any character traits are behavioral traits are specifically aligned to any gender. It seems to me very much a part of our social programming. I mean, there are more. There are a lot more kind of more macho characters in this story, as it is, for example, the captain of in the human camp and the professor, for example. And in contrast, our hero is very strong, but ultimately he just wants to save the girl that am I giving too much away? He just wants to he's doing things out of love, not out of a desire to dominate the world as or to take over something, to attack some. So yes, I mean, it's in a way it's a closer, like you're saying, it's a closer subject to us all than it seems, because gender discussions could be confined to the academic arena, or to those who identify as queer or non-binary. But it's actually a lot of the times it's a lot closer to everyone, probably.
Yeah, for sure. I saw an old uni lecturer I have who he is himself queer, so maybe it's more relevant to him, but I saw him commenting on someone's post on Facebook saying gender stinks, we're just used to the smell. I don't know if I agree completely, but the idea that it's sort of everywhere, whether you like it or not, and in different ways, seems true to me.
Yeah, it's definitely everywhere because it's such an artificial construct, really. And yeah, so going back to the question,
back to the text. Yes.
So part of what I wanted to do in this book is because I'm always interested in gender nonconformance. So here's a story with a male character who has a softer side, but then I also have in my collection a story that features probably the most gun-toting, gung-ho male hero who just wants to kill all the robots in his way to get back to his little girl. And that's written by a woman. So
right.
I really like that. And these two are some of the youngest authors in my book. And I think it's important and really interesting to show readers that this is now what's coming out of China. This is the kind of Kehuan that's coming out.
For sure.
Now,
reading some of the stories, I'm seeing the authors' names or pen names just in their pinyin and their alphabet spellings. And to be honest, even if I did see the Hanzi, the Chinese characters for their names, I would not know if they were generally masculine or feminine names. So for some of the stories, I thought, this one reminds me of some of the short stories by the younger female Chinese writers I've read. But whoa, there's violence, there's this, there's that. So my stereotypes aren't helping me here. Is the author going to be male or female? Is part of it seems silly to say, but it was part of the, it was alongside trying to find out what happens in the plot by reading to the end. I'll get to Xueting's little note, and then I'll find out if this is a male or female writer. Sounds silly, but that was my reaction as a reader.
That's a really fascinating point. In the Chinese pseudonyms, you can still kind of tell whether they're male or female, but in the romanizations, you can't. So not only are the readers in the dark about where the story comes from. They're also in the dark about the gender of the author. That could be a very interesting reading experience.
Yeah, like looking through the names, I'm trying to think out of the authors I didn't already know, or imagining I didn't know them, would I know based on their Romanized names whether they're male or female? And the answer is no, except for Anna Wu, but that's cheating because that's her English name.
That's right.
Yeah. Our next question is about your role as the translator. Just doing one question about this, but I'm sure there'll be plenty, or at least there'll be something interesting to say. And it's a straightforward one. Did the story present you with any particular joys, challenges, or even struggles?
Yeah, all of those. I really enjoyed translating it. Most of it was really fun and felt really natural. It was almost like I'm reading the story in Chinese. Here, readers, I'm telling you, here's the story in English. Yeah, it flowed very well. Most of the stories are between something like 8,000 to 15,000 words, or maybe 20. This one is twice as long. I wouldn't have picked something, I think, for an anthology if, it didn't work even at that length as a story, as a piece that's part of a bigger body of work. Yeah, so the challenges were quite interesting in a way. They were definitely a challenge now that I think about it and break it down a little. So most of it was to do with the linguistics, because in this story, the sàngshī have a language of their own. Due to rigor mortis, their throats and windpipes have, rotted away, or they've fallen out, so they can't speak, but they use a sort of sign language with their hands or arm or whatever's left of their body to communicate. And the challenge was conveying this language. And of course, that's the sign language is another different one from Chinese to English, from Chinese and English. Conveying that, and we talked about intertextuality, so many different genres kind of all melting into one story, making it all fit together and kind of pulling together two sides with very different points of view, the humans and the sàngshī, and kind of making, because each side had their slang to the other almost species. They're different species. They see each other as different species, as even though the sàngshī used to be humans. So very often with kind of subgroups, you'll find that they have this kind of pejorative slang term that they use to refer to the majority as a kind of coping mechanism, So the sàngshī are no different. So they have, and the humans are definitely, in this story, they are afraid of the sàngshī. They don't remember that they're once their friends and relatives. They fear them. So it's, pulling together the two sides, of very different language and the slang terms they use to refer to each other, the human language, the sàngshī language, but also the sàngshī have a biological instinct that is different in this story to their higher instincts. So very often they are showing something completely the opposite in their body language, in their communication, in their body language and in their behavior to what they're actually communicating. So it's making all of those things fit together smoothly. I think that was the challenge. It was quite fun as well.
Yeah, there's I won't spoil it, but there's there's a very surreal scene where, what can I say? Well, imagine I'm I don't know, I'm chasing after my friend, but I'm also apologizing for chasing after him and cheering him on. That might sound like I'm spoiling it, but it's much funnier than that. Yeah, I can imagine why that would be a funny, not a funny one, an amusing and also mind vexing thing to get into. Nice, not just translating it. I'm sure a translation would be easy enough, but making it work as a piece of writing for readers, that's got to be a puzzle.
But in other ways, it was really worth doing because that's what makes it such a captivating story, that there are so many different layers to it, apart from the plot and what happens. And in a way, you can reread this story again and again and find different things that are amusing or enjoyable about it. So going back to the specific language, linguistic translation, although it probably has something to do with the essence of the story as well. So going back to the slang terms that humans and sàngshī refer to each other. So I got a sense at the very beginning reading this story that the humans really don't like the zombies, the sàngshī. They fear them. They kind of think that they're gross and disgusting. So, which is why I came up with the term stiffs. I think it conveys a kind of disregard for their dignity, not even referring to them as in a proper term, but, as just stiffs. And it sort of, I think it stuck because it really worked, that term. And then I also wanted to distinguish between zombies and stiffs, because we are dealing with a very different tradition here from the Western zombie stories. So then in terms of the humans, the stiffs, the sàngshī towards the humans, they have their own slang terms. They're called breathers, call them breathers. So a lot of linguistic challenges, but quite interesting to work into, I think, the subtext of the story, making the language, the English language version, kind of convey what the Chinese aims to convey, but in a way that works in English, and in a way that works in Western culture as well as in English.
For sure, yeah. All the tiny invisible references that build up the way I say we, there's an implied we there that you could dig into, but the way that people read stories, for sure. It's going to have a challenge for any translator, but as you can imagine, it comes up on this show a lot, that for Chinese to English, and presumably for Chinese to just about any European language, there's some particular puzzles there for the translator.
Yeah.
If you feel we've done Ashwa and Fire of the Other Shore justice, I'm ready to jump into the more miscellaneous fun questions.
Okay.
Cool. And it's right on time because my Bluetooth headphones battery is running low. So we'll see if we make it to the end without them dying and becoming zombie headphones. So first miscellaneous question, it's the word of the day. Is there a Chinese word of the day you'd like to suggest that either is from or represents nicely Flower of the Other Shore?
So word of the day for Flower of the Other Shore would be sàngshī. Sang meaning to do with mourning or deceased. Shi meaning corpse. I think it is the distinction between jiangshi, which a term that the Chinese use to refer to the jiangshi of their traditional law. So the traditional Chinese undead monster, the jiangshi, and also to Western zombie films and zombie fiction, depending on the context. So sàngshī is distinct from both of those. And it's important to remember that as a genre, the Chinese sàngshī genre is very young. And although it does interact and it has been influenced from Western traditions of zombie stories, it is very much a thing of its own. And so I think it's very interesting to see what comes out of China, what comes out of Chinese writers on this genre. So I would love to see it introduced into the Anglophone world and becoming current as a word as an English word, 上市.
So there's our word of the day. We've already sort of analysed it, so no need to pick it apart like a piece of decaying flesh with a flower growing in it any more than we need to. So let's go on to the next silly question. An interesting one, given how much of our main characters' thoughts are about consuming and eating. This is a drinking based question. If Flower of the Other Shore were a drink, what would it be? And I say this to all the guests, but there are two stern decrees here. You can't just say a really strong coffee, because I had that like right off the bat from multiple guests. And a cocktail, the next one, this has a degree of leniency. You can say a cocktail of everything if you can tell me what's in the cocktail, but otherwise anything goes. And if you can't think of the drink, you can do a food.
So I would say it's a bit like a oolong, which is my favorite type of tea. It's certainly got a kick to it, but not too much. It has a very complex aroma and taste. Tastes slightly bitter but sweet, and has the roasted nutty aroma, almost like a roasted coffee type aroma. It is fragrant. The color of the tea is often described as blue, as opposed to green tea or black tea or yellow tea. Quite a kind of rare, novel concept, blue tea. And I think the color blue is very prevalent, kind of pervades the story in terms of when you think of the flower. Yes, and furthermore, oolong tea is supposed to have euphoric properties. So it's a bit like this story, which is more than the sum of its parts. Okay, end of the second patch.
Yeah, it's good that we got another tea, because of course there's so many kinds of tea in the world. Many of them are Chinese tea, but we've only had a few episodes where someone, for their if the story was a drink, named a Chinese tea. So that's great that we've got another one in the bag. Next question in this miscellaneous section, it's bringing things back to yourself and your work.
Mm-hmm.
Are you working on anything just now? And are there any works or websites or other places where we could point the listeners?
Apart from working on having just about finished the last iterations of Synopticon, I do have a nice surprise for the readers when the book comes out, in the book that's not currently disclosed.
Okay.
And then there are articles. There are always articles, whether they're on my website or for other platforms. I contributed an essay on China's internet literature for the tour collection called The Way Spring Arrives, which will be published in March 2022.
Yep.
And other than that, I'm plotting the upcoming project, so the next couple of books really at the moment.
Great. It's like you said, the Way Spring Arrives, all the authors, and I believe the translators too, are female or non-binary.
That's right.
So in other words, no men are in there, and Atra is a man. So yeah, I missed that key point.
Well, what I wanted to do, I really wanted to spotlight female voices in Chinese science fiction, but I really didn't want to sort of almost create a marginalized space. I did consider maybe just featuring female writers, but then in the end, I decided to just go for the stories on the merit alone. So kind of whether it's a good story, whether it's unique in a way, the perspective is unique, or the way it's told. And it turned out to be kind of half, but just over half is female voices. So I think that's quite nice in a way
for that
to happen. It shows that, it's completely untrue that women can't do sci-fi, that, women can't do 科幻 or,
or sci-fi.
Or soft sci-fi is in any way less appealing or less science fiction than hard sci-fi.
Yeah, for sure. And it shows in your collection because there's soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi by the female writers in there. And looking at the male writers, so we mentioned how Xue in the story comes across as not trying to be a hard man and sending up some of those hard man action tropes, whilst also, I guess, at the same time giving you, the reader, some of the fun of the action and stuff. But then the other male writers we've got are an interesting case too, because there's one of my faves, Han Song, who there's lots of things we could say about his writing, but if there's something not essentially male, but a male sort of stereotype, one type of guy, the incredibly depressed, the universe is meaningless, this is grim, but I'm going to sort of grin and bear it and chuckle kind of way of dealing with life and the universe. That's really evident in terms of the universe, the story in here. And I was hugely into that. And then we have another version, another genre of male writer, maybe genre of guy, Return of Adam by Wang Jingkang, who I think is the oldest author in the book. And
that's right, yeah.
That one I don't rush towards and embrace, but it's interesting to see it. It's
yes, it definitely very much is there to show that it very much demonstrates the kind of stories that Chinese sci-fi have developed from, really. Yeah. And I mean, it is challenging its own way. It challenges Confucianism as a kind of mode of behavior for the Chinese, whether that's the absolute best thing that it's made out to be. But there's quite a bit of
chauvinism, is that a word?
Yes, there's quite a bit of chauvinism in it that I wasn't quite comfortable with, but then when you read on in the story, you kind of see, right, he's kind of being defeated by the characters. Sort of, I think I used foisted on his own petard in the story guide.
So it's not black or white. It's not a simple thing to just condemn or cheer. It's not an author's manifesto either. It's his creative work.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that you have a chauvinist character, and his chauvinism is used against him, really, and that's what it's there for, rather than, I think that's what it's there for, rather than let's say a condoning of this kind of thinking.
Yeah, for sure.
You can leave this in, or you can take this out. I don't mind.
I'll keep it in. We've had spicier conversations on the show, but the listeners are smart. They understand that it's fiction. Fiction is complicated. Next question. We were getting dangerously serious, but now we're getting on to just like the final questions, basically the further reading questions.
I would like to go through just quickly what I'm reading, if that's okay with you.
No, you should, yeah.
So I've got this really bad habit where I start several books. I've got several books on the go. And when I read a novel that's really I really enjoy, When I read a novel that I really enjoy, I kind of am hesitant to finish it. So when I get to about the end, I would maybe start another story and leave that one for a while before I finish it. But at the moment, I've been reading some essays on Chinese science fiction, but also dipping into Wang Dewei's David Wang, a new literary history of modern China, which is really fascinating because it deals with literature from, all kinds of literature, not just prose, but poetry, and even things like fanfic and old legends. So yeah, that one I enjoy dipping into, but I always have a treat read that it's just fun for pleasure. And at the moment, it's Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning, which I really, really enjoy. Because lately, recently, I've been catching up on works by other writers of color and female writers. It's something I have had to catch up on and not really read a lot of before. I've grown up on a diet of the English literary canon, which is mostly white and a lot of them male. So it's been a real delight to catch up on these works, and I've been becoming increasingly interested in kind of non-Western centric views, kind of sort of cultures outside of, say, America or Europe.
What was the name of the author again? Rebecca something?
Roanhorse.
Okay.
And the novel is called Trail of Lightning. I think it's one of a series, and it fuses a post-apocalyptic world with native Indian mythology and beliefs.
Right. Cool. So American in a sense, but not that European sense, the Native American sense.
That's true. Yes.
In the geographic
sense. It is American,
sense.
the original American.
The OG. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So I suppose, non-Anglophone is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. I'll stop nitpicking the geography, and I guess.
Or we could be here till Christmas.
Yeah,
that's true.
A lot of geography out there. I'm trying to think, what am I reading right now? I'm reading the next book I'm doing on the show, so I won't spoil that for listeners, although I've told them on Twitter if they want to go look there. But I guess I'll just say thanks for the fantastic chat. Always fun talking about Chinese sci-fi, but even more fun talking to such a thoughtful translator with so much to say. So thank you, Xueting, for coming on the show for the interview.
Thank you, Angus. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you, and I really enjoyed being on your show.
And the interview is over. Listeners, I hope you enjoyed that one, hearing from Xueting about her, just the story that she translated. I know I enjoyed doing the interview, so yeah, I'm sure you enjoyed listening to it. So the show is almost over now, just time for the plugs, and the one I really want to emphasize today is listener feedback. If you've got your own thoughts and you don't just want to keep them to yourself, then please do let me know. If someone's bothering you about the show, or if there's something you really love about the show, or if there is something that you would like to see more of, or indeed less of, I'd love to know, to be honest. Please do reach out and tell me what's on your mind. And that sort of leads very naturally into the next plugs, where you can do those things, the social media, the points of contact. So I already mentioned the Twitter and the Instagram. My personal Twitter, @AngusLikesWords, is where you can tweet or DM me. You can DM me on Instagram too, @TrChFic, TrChFic. That's the podcast's Instagram account. If you want to share thoughts with other fans, we have a Discord. There's an invite link for that in the show notes. I mean, I've said this a couple of times before, the Discord's pretty quiet, but occasionally people do sort of pop in with thoughts to share with everyone. And of course, it is another place where you can DM your host and give feedback. I've had a couple of listeners have done that. Maybe they didn't want to share it with everyone. That's great too. If it's critical feedback or praise, I want to hear them both. So yeah, that is all the pluggy plugs. I won't spend whole minutes talking about the Patreon and the other ways to support the show, but there's zillions of bonus episodes on Patreon. Well, not zillions, but there's more than there are episodes on the main feed, so there's a lot for you to enjoy on there. Right, I've got that out of the way, the grubby money stuff. So I'll just now tell you the best thing you can do for the show, which is spreading the word. Tell people who you think might be interested. Share the links online. Do things. I was about to say mouth to mouth. How disgusting. I should have said word of mouth. Or whatever the internet equivalent of word of mouth is. But anyway, yeah, tell your friends, tell your teachers, tell the zombie that is chewing your leg and simultaneously falling in love with you. Until the next episode, or until we next talk on your favorite social media platform, 再见.